Namaste to all. So I have been given the responsibility, or you can say that I have chosen to speak on this topic, nature of perception, the Cārvākian viewpoint. Actually, there are only a few texts available on Cārvāka philosophy. Why I have chosen this text, this topic, due to the reason that I have written a book, Nava Cārvāka Karikavali, 2 years ago, and due to this writing, it was considered that I will be a good person to speak on the Cārvāka viewpoint on perception. The Cārvāka philosophy is very unique philosophy. Very unique in the sense that this is the single philosophy which is bold enough to accept that it accepts only veracity of perception. Other philosophies make room for other pramanas. However, Cārvāka philosophy, as it is understood, as it is presented in the simple way that it believes only in the empirical world. There is another name for this philosophy, Lokayata. Why it is called the Lokayata? There are two connotations. One idea is this one, that this philosophy is Lokayat philosophy because this Lok means common people, and common people accept this philosophy, therefore it is called a Lokayat. But I am of this different opinion, and I think that is the sense of this philosophy, and that Lok means what is perceptible world. This philosophy is limited to the perceptual world. What is perceptible? This philosophy limited itself to that world. Nothing beyond that acceptable. Therefore, this philosophy is a unique philosophy. But this is ridiculous. What to understand the nature of perception from this philosophy? Because we do not have any text. While writing this text, Nava Cārvāka Karikavali, this idea I left opened. Because I have not discussed this idea, what is the nature of perception according to Cārvāka philosophy. That idea I have left open because of two reasons. One is that, as my understanding goes, I think that the Cārvāka philosophers and the scientists follow the same path. Because the Cārvāka philosophers say that we believe only on the perception, and changing only a little bit, the scientist would say that we believe on experiments. But later on, what could be the situation? In Tattva Chintamani, inferential chapter, Chattopadhyay says, Anumana pramande pratyakṣasyapi apramandyat. This is not the exact line. But the intention is this one, that if you do not believe in the inference, you cannot establish the authenticity of perception. When you say Pratyakṣatiriktam na pramanam, you have to use a one pramana, because without The question can be asked whether your this is a very difficult situation for Charvaka. And following the line of Chattopadhyay, when Didhitika was explaining that sentence, he classified Charvaka philosophers with Sautrantic Buddhist philosophers. Buddhist philosophers make a distinction between Swarakshana and the Samanya Lakshana. And the Buddhist position is this one, that only perception is Paramarthic and inference is Vyavaharic. Therefore, many places it is said Pratyakṣa never pramana in Buddhist philosophy. Because Anuman is actually empirical. So, should we try to understand Charvaka philosophy very much akin to this Buddhist philosophy? When we are discussing about the nature of perception, or there is any other way around to understand Charvaka? There is another point also which is very much discussed. When the Charvaka philosophers refuted the perception, they refuted the inference, and it is said, Shatashaha Sahacharitayorapi Devichara Darshana. Observed something 100 times or more than 100 times, we cannot be sure that in the future the same will happen. Therefore, inference is not pramana. So, while rejecting this statement, the authenticity of inference, and it is actually many times said that this position of Charvaka is actually the gist of Charvaka philosophy, because there they produce their novelty in refuting the inference. Let me take one point. There is a Brihaspati Sutra which says, Pramanasya agumnatvad anumanad artha pratyayo durlabha. Praman is agaun, and anuman, it is difficult to get ascertainment from inference. The point is this one, that this ascertainment is achievable only through perception. Therefore, perception is pramana and anuman is not pramana. And if we take this Brihaspati Sutra, the whole argument which is presented by Didhitikara appears to be misleading, appears to be going in a different direction, and the Charvaka philosophy should not go in that direction. The argument many times presented from the side of Charvakas, it is many times doubtful whether the same argument was put forward by Charvakas or not, because the rejection of inference can be very well found in Vakyapadya. And while rejection of while rejection of inference, the the Vakyapadiya, the author of Vakyapadiya, Bhartrihari, accepts the authenticity of Pratyakṣa and also Shabda Pramana, Agama Pramana. So, what could be the position of Cārvāka while explaining this situation? So, here I think the Cārvāka philosophy of perception should be a philosophy of naive kind of perception, because he is always accepting the veracity of our day-to-day life. It is a realist philosophy, and we can observe very clearly. If we put Cārvākas on the same boat with Sautrantikas, there could be the idealistic problem, because we can see in Pramanavartik there is idealistic situation is also available. But the Cārvāka philosophy cannot go in that direction. Secondly, when you are accepting that only perception is pramana, there could be a question, how will you believe that perception is pramana? Because there are so many cases where perception is considered, one's perception is justified, that it is not pramana at all. For example, when you are confusing a rope, a piece of rope as a snake, and later on you discover that this is not actually the piece of rope, this is not snake but piece of snake, piece of rope. So in that situation, perception can also be many times confusing. So how to understand this Cārvāka philosophy when we are discussing the nature of perception? We should take into consideration 2 points. One, should we follow the path which is being explored by the scientists, neuroscientists, who are considering how our brain functions, or should we take into consideration the Cārvāka viewpoint? I think for the Cārvākas, the knower is the body, not the brain. Brain is not the knower, because there is an identity. Who is knowing, the same person is doing. So brain, if brain is knower, then you have to say brain is the doer. But I think it would not be acceptable to the Cārvāka philosophers, because they would say that body is the doer. And what is I, that is simple way can be understood as you. When we are interacting with other persons, what is the other? The other person is the body. Different bodies are other persons. And I am also the body. So this is the Cārvāka philosophy in gist. Accordingly, they will have to explain their philosophy of perception. So the philosophy of perception, if explained in this way, I think there will be necessity to accept 2 types of perceptions. I think following the footsteps of Nayayikas, where they accept that there is a kind of nirvikalpak perception, and nirvikalpak means there could be the questions, and Professor Chakrabarty presented this viewpoint very beautifully explained, and he argued that nirvikalpak perception should be that point which can be explored by the scientists or brain scientists because which part of our brain gets activated. This is not the business of the philosopher. The business of philosophers is this one, what they get. Here, in a simple way, I see the person coming to meet me, and accordingly I will have to act. Because the Cārvākian, as he propounded the theory of evolution of consciousness, this is a kind of evolutionary theory. And here they can accept very well the evolution propounded by Charles Darwin or other philosophers. How we are evolved, accordingly we perceive. You can see, we perceive the colors, but many people are there who are colorblind persons who cannot perceive the colors. Even the dogs cannot perceive the colors. But dogs can perceive so many things we cannot perceive. That's why so many types of smell. And the example was given so long because they need to pursue. If they do not pursue so long, they will not survive. The survival is dependent upon this perception, and the perception is the basic thing on which we can survive. So how we perceive and what we perceive, so who is the perceiver? The knower is the perceiver. The knower and perceiver, these two are not distinct persons. And knower, perceiver, who desires and who acts, these are identical. So how we perceive? For example, I perceive there is a book on the table. So this perception, and accordingly we utter the sentences also. Accordingly we infer also. So the idea from the Cārvāka perspective is this one, and I also propounded in this book, that when the Cārvāka philosophers say that inference is not a pramana, they are not saying that inference doesn't provide us any piece of information. Inferences do provide us new piece of informations, but they are not ascertained in that sense. Because unless you experience it, you cannot be sure that this cognition is true. So for the generation of inference, we have to depend upon perception, and also for the verification of that inference, we have to depend on perception. And in the same way, there could be a room for verbal testimony. However, this verbal testimony is not a kind of pramana. However, here there is a distinction between Cārvāka philosophy and also Buddhist philosophy, because Buddhist philosophers made a room. What is grasped by inference, that cannot be grasped by perception, and what is grasped by perception, that cannot be grasped by inference. The objects of these two pramanas are completely different, exclusive. But in the day-to-day life, how the example is there, we perceive the fire, we perceive the smoke, and also we infer the fire, seeing the smoke. So the whole idea of inference can be accommodated in Cārvāka perspective with a modification that it is not certain. Therefore, it cannot be certain, because this perception is always inductive. What you call deductive, this is alien to Cārvāka philosophers and also alien to Indian philosophical tradition, as I understand. Because for the Indian philosophical tradition, inference is something you move from one to another. One, when you are perceiving some cases, later on you come to the cognition, what is known as deduction, the general rule, what is known as Vyapti Jnana, and through Vyapti Jnana you conclude. So here it is acceptable to Cārvāka philosophers that Vyapti Jnana cannot be so much sure. Wherever there is a smoke, there is a fire. You cannot always be sure, because there could be some situations also. And then whenever you are concluding that there is a fire, this vyavahar is there, empirical usages are there, but going in this direction will not be sufficient and it will not be justified very well. Therefore, the Cārvāka's viewpoint is this one, simply that this our experience which goes in our day-to-day life, that is actually savikalpak, vyavasayatmak, nishchayatmak. And there is a stage of perception which one is not in the kind of sense data, and if you are explaining in that sense, there is no problem at all. That is grasped, and later on there is savikalpak perception. So this praman, what is considered as perception by Cārvākas, they will have to accept that this savikalpak perception is praman, and on the basis of that all our experiences, all our actions go on. So I think in this direction we should develop this Cārvāka philosophy, and I am not taking much time because much earlier I had been given this piece. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we can take only one question.
So I should have been there.
Cārvākas, they accept the existence of mind, intelligence, and all these.
Oh, good. 1 minute, sir.
Maybe from there on.
The point is this one, what you understand from the term intelligence. Because nowadays we are being aware of another term, what is known as artificial intelligence, isn't it? So what is the artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence, in the same way, according to Cārvāka philosophers, all intelligence is actually artificial intelligence. No intelligence is natural. Every intelligence is artificial, because every intelligence is product of inert. Every intelligence is product of inert. So if every intelligence is product of inert, so every intelligence is artificial intelligence for the Cārvāka. Okay.